Kind of Chinese style.
I know, we should get like a pot of tea or
Yeah,
something.
we should get a pot of tea. I don't know, we don't have anything, huh?
We get this little hot water heater, but I don't think it's quite the same thing.
Yeah. All right. Hi and welcome to, of course, China. Today I'm here with Jeremiah Jenne. We're sitting in my Airbnb room in a Hutong in Beijing. And I'm having Jeremiah here since I had the chance to see him once again after a few years.
Yeah.
And Jeremiah is a writer and an historian living in Beijing since 2002. Hi Jeremiah.
Hey Steph, how you doing?
Very official we are.
I know, it feels like this is very much like, state meeting.
Yeah,
Should be negotiating some kind of boundary or truce or something.
There was a lot of that going on in some of the Hutongs around maybe
Probably
100 years ago.
an earlier era perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I wanted to ask you, why did you come to China?
Yeah, that's a question my mom asked me a lot.
Yeah.
When I was in college, I really wanted to study history. I've always loved history. And, one of the things about when I was in college, which was, in the late Middle Ages, their registrations were done by going into the gymnasium at assigned times and running to a table and signing your name for the classes you wanted. And it just turned out that the history classes that were about U.S. history were just completely full. And so I kind of got shuffled over to the other tables, and I started taking classes in all other kinds of history, and I got drawn to Asian history. There are some good professors where I went to school that I really enjoyed taking the classes. My junior year, I did a year in Singapore doing a project looking at the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. After I graduated, I spent some time working in Washington, D.C., and then decided, maybe I should just continue my love of history. And I thought about what aspects of history, and Asian history particularly, interested me. And I've always been thinking about like China, but particularly thinking about China in terms of empire. And so studying the last empire of China, the Qing Empire, studying the era of imperialism in China. And of course, to do all of that, I was going to have to do work in the Chinese archives. But to do that, of course, you need to learn the Chinese language. And all of that eventually brought me to Beijing in about 2002. And for the first 2 years I was here, I spent much of my time just kind of, in intensive language programs, trying to get my Chinese speaking to some extent, but a lot of it was reading,
Right.
Being able to use documents up to some kind of like to good level.
Did you study with a private tutor, with a center, a university? What was it?
So the first year I was at Peking University. I was at a program there, and then the second year, this was I guess 2003 and 2004, I was at a program called IUP, which is an older program. It's been going on since the middle of the 20th century, first in Taiwan, and it was the program that a lot of academics, people who work in the U.S. government, they went to get their. It's Chinese boot camp. I mean, they go in there and they say, you come to China, but you're not going to see China. There's a forbidden city, you won't see it. There's a summer palace, forget about it. You're going to see the classroom, you're going to see our library, and you're going to see whatever hovel that you sleep in, and that's what we're going to do for the next year. And, I make it sound pretty harsh, but it's a really great way to kind of just get your Chinese up to a level that it needs to be, especially if you're doing things professionally. Although the way they teach you, especially if you're studying history, is kind of weird in the sense that, like, I knew how to say, the semi-feudal, semi-colonial state of China in the 19th century before I knew how to ask for ketchup in a restaurant. So that was a little bit odd, but yeah, that's what I did for the first couple of years.
And you know how to ask for ketchup today.
I do know how to ask for ketchup today, although, one of the challenges with the way I studied Chinese, and this is not any fault of my teachers, who were the most patient, saintly people you could ever possibly imagine, because I am, as I'm reminded repeatedly by people I speak to here, an idiot. And is that I spent a lot of time like looking at learning to read characters, and that's great. So I really, if I was going to go back and learn Chinese again today, the first thing I would do, I think, is spend most of my time not worrying about learning to read and write characters, but just like drilling the tones and the pronunciation like early on and just really hard, because there are so many things that, you know, little mistakes I kind of picked up my first couple of years of speaking Chinese that I still have today. You know, like a lot of sort of middle-aged white foreigners speaking Chinese, me and the tones, we're not as close friends as we should be or we were in the past. Like, we're trying to reconnect. Like, me and fourth tone, we're texting a little bit. We might hang out later, but like I'm trying to make those connections again so that my Chinese doesn't, you know, perpetually sound like I'm 7 years old with a head injury.
Do you need to use a lot of Chinese in daily life in Beijing?
You know, these days in work, sure. If I'm working with colleagues who are Chinese, sometimes it's easier to speak Chinese. But what often happened through a lot of my professional life, either working in academic programs or working in my own company, a lot of the people I work with from China, they have the same kind of, it's the same situation I have, but in reverse. They understand English really, really well. It's just sometimes responding in English, it's hard to sometimes articulate what we want to say in a language that's not our own. And anyone who studied a foreign language knows this. We always express ourselves better and with more nuance in our native tongue. And so what ends up happening usually is that a lot of my colleagues and they'll speak Chinese and I will speak English. And it's kind of a situation that I think of like speaking Star Wars. You've ever seen Star Wars movies? Everybody speaks their own language and everyone seems to understand what's being said. No one ever actually speaks a foreign language except that one robot. You know, there's like Han Solo and Chewbacca and they're sitting there and like, Han's like, well, I don't know. It must be like the hyperdrive. And Chewbacca's like, well, no, I don't think it's the third thing from the left. I'm like, how is this even? Yeah, that's kind of what ends up happening.
All right. So what's a historian in Beijing? What your days look like?
So for the last few years, I've run a company called Beijing by Foot. And for a long time, I was a full-time teacher teaching history for American students who were studying in China in a study abroad program, kind of like the one I went to when I went to Singapore when I was at university. And so I still teach, but I usually only teach about one course a semester. So an average day for me probably looks a little bit like, in the morning, I'll sometimes have a class. In the afternoon, I'll be working with a group, either a school group, a group from an embassy, group of travelers, or maybe a visiting program from another country. And they'll want to do a program in Beijing looking at the history of the city. And so what I do, in some ways it's a little bit like being a tour guide, but with the idea of trying to create a lesson plan that's both something they want to learn and also based on an area that we're going to be visiting. So for example, if we want to talk about what's the impact of imperialism in historical memory in China today, what's this legacy of this thing called the century of humiliation? Why is this such a big deal in sort of Chinese nationalism today? Well, yeah, we could sit in a conference room and I could show some slides and we could talk about it, or we could just go out to the Yuanming Unit, the old summer palace, and say, okay, this is this incredible imperial Disneyland that was being constructed, you know, piece by piece, you know, building by building for 150 years, and then a whole lot of white people just burned this place to the ground. And actually, that's not totally fair because the British sent also a lot of Indian soldiers to fight on their behalf. Let's just say the armies of the British and French wiped that thing to the ground. And, you know, those ruins are here. Everyone's here. They're kind of taking this in. This is the story. And so when we talk about it, it has resonance. And that's one of the reasons, too, you know, why I've been here for a long time is as a teacher, when I was teaching full-time and even now when I teach part-time, if you're going to teach history about China, the best place to do it is in China.
Right.
And, you know, the same thing, too, with being somebody who works in kind of educational travel and working with groups. If you're going to talk about China, if you're going to get people to appreciate China and Chinese history, let's do it here. Let's have these conversations, but let's do it at the site. So that's kind of what I spend a lot of my days doing.
Right. So you're basically immersed in history of China and Beijing and China, I guess, right?
It is. I mean, if I wasn't doing this, if I was, say, like at a desk job in you know, back home in the United States, I would spend my free time, you know, the weekends reading books about Chinese history, and, you know, so I mean, the fact that I get paid to do this is just, it kind of boggles my mind every morning, and you know, it's I'm pretty grateful that I'm able to kind of do that.
It's interesting. Do you always know you always liked history as a little kid too?
You know, I think I like stories, and I love the way that, you know, maybe in school, you know, we went to math class and there was a lot of theories and formula, and in English class there were stories, but it seemed like a lot of it was diagramming sentences. In history class, though, it was about the stories. It was about, you know, what this person did, or what these people did, or, you know, how we got to this point, you know, and I just found that to be really fascinating. I know that not everybody does. I know a lot of people think that history class is like, oh, God damn, I gotta remember those dates, remember that guy's name, and I get that. My goal, I think, when I think of history really being about the stories, I think that was what attracted me to it. And also for me, that's kind of how I approach teaching it, because I think people remember the stories. And I you know, it's tough because you don't want to turn complicated historical, you know, events or eras into, like, you know, anecdotes. But I do think for a lot of people that if you have a story that they can hang, you know, their understanding or to kind of take hold of, then it becomes easier to then also talk about some of the dynamics and context around that. And I think that helps people, at least for me anyway, that helped me to really appreciate some of these really important things in history. And I hope that, you know, in my own small and somewhat inarticulate way, I'm able to do that for other people as well.
Is China history more interesting than other countries' history, or is it like every country has? I mean, not every, but many countries have interesting history.
Well, I think with China, first of all, there's obviously a lot of it.
Right.
You know, I remember in graduate school when we were taking our qualifying exams, and the people who majored in, like, or focused on U.S. history were like, yeah, man, I gotta learn everything about the Gilded Age. I'm like, how long was the Gilded Age? It was like a decade. I've got 5,000 years here, people. Like, come on. So there's that. But I think too, part of it is that, and this is, I mean, for people in China, this is like, of course, this is our history. This is, we know this stuff really cold, but it's amazing that you have this incredible body of history. It's, you know, thousands of years of events. How many thousands of years is a little bit of some dispute, but thousands of years of these events and historical figures who are as famous and as important and are still cultural touchstones in a way in China that, you know, in the United States, we have George Washington, we have, you know, England, you know, they have, you can go back to like things like King Arthur or, you know, some of the queens and kings. But in China, you have this huge pantheon of historical figures and events that, frankly, most people outside of kind of Asia aren't that aware of. And I just found that to be amazing. Like when you kind of come here and you're like, wow, there was all this history I learned about the rest of the world, and now there is like almost this whole other universe of history. You know, it's one of the things I've never really been, I mean, I've read like a lot of like fairly geeky Americans. I've read like The Lord of the Rings, and I've read a couple of like the Game of Thrones books, but I've never been totally into like the whole science fiction fantasy genre, because it's like, why am I going to learn about this whole universe of like history and mythology when there are actual on this planet whole sections of the globe that have an amazingly complicated and rich history, mythology, that I can explore that actually has some relevance to, you know, real people.
Did you know much about it before you thought, I want to learn Chinese history?
Going into college, no.
No.
You know,
something ignited something, right? Like you learned some of it, and then you're like, wow.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. You know, I mean, once you kind of, you're like, once you start pulling that thread, you're like, huh. So this Mao guy seems pretty important.
Right.
And you start going back and back and back, and you know, if for those people who, if you're a person who loves history, this will not come as a shock. But it's just like, you know, you start like, oh, I got to find out like, who is that guy who talked to that guy, or who is that, you know, this group of women who were like, what were they doing, you know, on that boat in the 18th century writing poetry, when I thought like all these women were supposed to be like, you know, at home, bound foot and illiterate. Like, what's going on with that? Let's find out. And you know, that's, for me, that just,
it's fascinating.
It's fascinating. It's the kind of thing like you wake up in the morning, it's like, one thing I really wanted to find out today. I got to go make sure I can find that book.
Can you make friends with people that don't like history?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, some people are not really into that at all, right?
No, I get that.
You get that? I mean,
Yeah.
well, what's the difference between a person that likes history or not? I mean, I don't know. It's
Well, I mean, it's they're generally not as much fun at pub quizzes.
no.
But I get people. I get the idea that the subject of history for some people brings up bad memories. As I said, I think part of it's the way a lot of times history was taught in school.
Right, the way they taught it. Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of people kind of that's a reaction, like, oh, history, I remember that class, that was the worst.
I think with history, for me, it's like it was one of the subjects when I graduated. I was like, I should have listened more. This is really interesting. Now I realize.
I think it's true. As you get older, you start to appreciate it more. I mean, when I was a kid, my father liked to have what we think of as sort of forced family fun. And, it would be pulling on the side of the road to, like, look at the historical marker of, like, this is where the first, lumber mill in Goffstown, New Hampshire was located. And you're like, oh, great. That mill is great, Dad. It's not there anymore. But there is a McDonald's down the road that I'm definitely interested in.
Yeah.
And I think as I've gotten older, I am that person.
Right.
I can see that.
I came here 17 years ago, and I don't. In the first few years, I didn't know much of the history of China, and after I learned some more of the recent history, 100 years, I became much less frustrated with things. It's like I understood them better. Like some things that I used to frustrate me, I understood why they're doing it, or at least I formed an opinion of why they're doing it. It made me feel a bit like, okay, I understand.
I think that comes with both learning a little bit about the culture. I think also comes from just kind of talking to people and kind of being willing to hear the perspective. I remember once many years ago kind of complaining, as is not unusual among foreigners in China, about the reluctance of some of our friends and neighbors to wait patiently in line. And I had one of my older Beijing friends say to me once, he goes, he kind of said in Chinese, he says, you remember that 60 years ago, there were like two people. One person waited patiently in line. The other person got the food they wanted. Old habits die hard. Just give us a break. And, he was kind of being tongue in cheek, but not, he kind of at a point. And, one of the things I think I realized the most being overseas, not just in China, but just going overseas, is just how nerf cushy, ridiculously white bread, easy my life was or is, given about where I was born and how I was brought up. And that was a total accident. And, I think one of the biggest mistakes that Americans make, although it's not just Americans, but that's kind of where I come from, is the thing where we go through, we kind of go through life running a race and not realizing that there were reasons that we kind of got to start the race, 20, 30, 40, 50 meters down the track.
Exactly.
And then, I look at how hard people here work and the lives that they had growing up, and I realize that if I grew up here, they would have eaten me for lunch. Like I would have been just roadkill on their path. These are people I know, friends of mine in China. I would have been roadkill on their way to success, because I did not have to work in my life nearly as hard as people work here just to kind of get by. I mean, you think about one thing I think about is like it's a joke. There's a lot of people in China, right? And like when I talk to school student groups, some people always ask me, they're like, so when we come to China, what's the one thing we got to be prepared for? And I'm like, well, there's a lot of people here. And everyone laughs like, yeah, it's funny because it's like 1.4 billion people. I'm like, no, there's a lot of people here. Like for anyone who's here, your whole existence is influenced and determined by the fact that you are one like mammal in a crowd of many other mammals. Well, think about just like getting on the subway. Imagine growing up where like everything any of us have ever had to compete for, like that place in school, the girl in your high school class, the job, anything like that. You were competing against 5-6 times the competition, or I would have had to compete against 5 or 6 times the competition I was competing against when I was back home. And that when I thought about that, right, and then I realized that people in Beijing can get a little pushy, shovey on the subway, and people waiting in line is something that other people do, and that as you said, once you start thinking about it that way, you're like, all right, like I don't totally like it, but I get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, selfishness today, in my view, comes from not having it before, and now I have it. I don't want to lose it. It's mine. Stuff like that that I see from people. And if you learn the history of the last 100 years, I think your life in China would be a bit easier.
Well, I think so. I think even in terms of like politics, you think about like. One of the things I've looked at, taking a look at the history is, all right, I come out of when I first came to China, like this is about the same time you did, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that surprised me the most was just like how supportive people here were of the system. Mm. And I grew up, I'm a product of like 1980s America. Like I was a kid in the 80s, and like I grew up with this thought that if you lived under communism, right, your life was just like this you were just miserable, and you were just waiting each day for Sylvester Stallone to show up and like liberate you and then feed you a cheeseburger, and and that was the way it worked. And so when I came here and everyone's like, it's okay, and I'm like, what do you mean okay? Like, I'm not Sylvester Stallone, but I could probably get him on the phone for you. Is that something you want? And what I realized is that there were a lot of things about here, just like anywhere, that were not great, but one of the things that I think surprised me the most, or when I started looking at history, I think really kind of changed my perspective, was that, for the last 200 years in China, things, the worst things that have happened to China have generally happened when the government's been too weak. You think about like the century of humiliation under foreign imperialism, culminating in the occupation of China by the Japanese. You can even make an argument that even some of the aspects of 20th century, things like the Cultural Revolution, occurred because the government kind of abdicated responsibility for governing society. If you look at it from that perspective and you think, okay, what's the worst that could happen? Well, in the West, the worst that can happen, at least in our Western political experience, has been like the rise of a Hitler or a rise of like, a Stalin or something. So our political systems are chaotic, messy, ridiculously inefficient, contraptions that don't really work, but they make it really hard for somebody to seize total power.
Right.
Unless you have a bunch of crazy redneck friends who want to take over a Capitol building.
Yeah.
But that's another issue. So in our system, we're willing to put up with a lot of like craziness as long as it doesn't lead to tyranny. I think in China, a lot of people here, they feel like, well, we'll put up with a little bit more authoritarianism and, restrictions if it means that we don't have the kind of chaos that had beset us in the past, or that sometimes we see in other countries. And I'm not saying I agree with that. I mean, what I'm saying is that's not what I would choose for me. I don't actually think that's a system of government that I think works best. But that's my personal opinion. Mm-hmm. But when someone tells me that they feel differently, I may disagree with them, but I understand.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And it's a little bit like what Chris Rock one time said about OJ. I'm not saying I would have killed her, but I understand.
Yeah.
And studying history, I think, really has helped me to kind of put me in the mindset of like, all right, what you're saying, this isn't propaganda. This isn't just like, you're just not feeding me a line. This is coming from a lived experience and also a historical experience, and I get that.
I think knowing more history, if any kind of history, maybe makes you a more balanced thinker. At the very least, like understanding things better, even things happening today because of history, right? It's like every country has its own complex. Yes. It's just a different complex. So, do they teach kids at school in China? Kids, primary school, middle school, high school? I know they don't study a lot of world history. My kids go to Chinese school.
Yeah.
It's starting to be a bit of a problem for me. But they study Chinese history. Do they study all Chinese history? Do you know? Do you have any idea what kind of history they study?
Well, one of the things I looked at over the years, I've taken a look at like high school textbooks. Textbooks are fascinating.
Yeah.
Because they really...
In the US too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
you know, you take a look at, you know, if you want to see kind of what a society thinks is important, take a look at the textbooks they give their kids. And, it can be quite scary sometimes what comes out of places like, you know, China and Kansas. But you know, they do learn a lot of, I think it's interesting. I think one of the interesting things about kids in China today, and even adults too, you go to a place like the Forbidden City, I think people know their own history a lot better than Americans know their own history. I think there's a couple reasons for that. Some of them are cultural, some of them is just also pop culture. So much of the pop culture in China involves historical dramas, historical TV shows, historical movies. So a lot of these characters that, you know, a lot of people know the princes and princesses, if you will, or consorts of like the Qing emperors about as well as a lot of kids in the West know the Avengers.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So there's that, and even though these are pop culture representations of them, they're still based on real figures. So there's kind of a connection there. So I think that, you know, at the times when I've worked with like Chinese students, I'm really amazed at the deep level of background knowledge a lot of them have of their own history, and I think that's really cool. I think there are some challenges though. I think one is that in the recent years there has been a turn away from world history, especially different comparative world systems. I think also there's the limitations of the patriotic education curriculum that came into place since the 1990s. And what's interesting about the systems is that if you look at the 19th century, for example, which is the era I kind of study the most, and I work a lot in imperialism and colonialism. If you take a look at the textbooks of that era, which is the Opium War, the Boxer War, these kind of things, it's not that different from the way I would tell the story in my own class. It lacks a little in nuance, but it's pretty much the same. You know, there's no way to parse it. Imperialism profoundly sucks. And it profoundly sucked here as much as it sucked, as much as it sucked anywhere in the world. But it's when you get to the 20th century that things start to get a little bit weird, because the 20th century textbooks tend to either minimize or completely remove some of the more devastating events of the 20th century, which gives a lot of kids here a little bit of a skewed version of their recent past. And that's troubling. And it's troubling whether you have a textbook like in places in the United States that minimize, for example, slavery, or try to recast the Civil War as being about, a lost cause or states' rights. It's troubling here too when major events that were, not just major events in China, the Great Leap Forward, you had 20, 25 million people that were possibly, victims of this, famine. That's a world historical event. That's an awful lot of our fellow human beings. And so when those things get removed from history, that's as someone who teaches history and loves history, that's troubling.
They don't know that. I mean, that tens of millions of people died. They just removed. It's just removed, or it's just portrayed in for different reasons.
It's portrayed as 3 years of natural disasters, and it minimizes any discussion of any government policies or political campaigns that would have led up to that or caused that situation. And so,
I see. So it's done like this. So they know that tens of millions of people died from starvation, but they don't know
why.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, so, give an example. I mean, you look at textbooks in the United States, and there were some textbooks not long ago enough that would talk about how, on the plantations in the South, they were good masters, and the slaves were happy and treated as members of the family. It doesn't remove it. It mentions the fact that there was slavery, but it tends to cast it in a way that would radically change the perspective. I mean, it would make it easier for somebody who was, say, a white student to go, "Oh, well, yeah, that was bad, but it wasn't that bad." The same way you could, if you were, say, someone from China in the 21st century, go, yes, when in the 1980s our country was desperately poor, but that had everything to do with the fact that it was that imperialism, which definitely was a part of that, and nothing to do with anything that happened after, say, 1949.
So China is criticized on these kind of issues, but you're saying that, the countries criticizing, they also should look at themselves in some things.
Well, I think it is one of the things about this patriotic education curriculum, especially when it refers to the 19th century, or the era known as the century of humiliation between the Opium War and 1949, is that it does also remind students that a lot of the countries that were carrying out these activities were the same countries that, just coincidentally, are China's biggest critics today. And so it creates the context for a narrative where you can, which, just like any good propaganda campaign has elements of truth, those countries are just trying to do today with them Nobel Prizes what they did that they couldn't do 100 years ago with gunboats.
Right.
And you can see why that is a narrative that would have resonance here, even if it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're saying, which is that, of course, I think that, it is annoying to me when we have people from, say, the United States, my own country, and they kind of unquestioningly, look at the human rights records of other countries and go, oh my goodness, that's terrible. And like, as if the United States is completely without blemish in this area. In fact, there are significant problems, starting with the fact that we made an entire race of people work for free for the better part of 300 years. But I also want to be careful too, into slipping into kind of a relativism. The reason why, I know about slavery too. The textbooks are flawed, right? But there are arguments about that. There are debates about that. I can go to the movies and see a movie that tells me now, that depicts the horrors of that. And is that perfect? Is that enough? Absolutely not. But it's there, and there is no aspect of that I think would have been made better if we just simply said, we really shouldn't talk about that because it's divisive. We shouldn't talk about race because it's a divisive issue, and that dividing is what really makes us weaker. And there are people in the U.S. who talk like that, and they are the technical term in the historical field is morons.
But they really believe that you sounded like my wife's mom, maybe. I mean, not that I heard her say this, but you know what I mean? Like, some of them, like, almost naively and innocently saying that. Some of them.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the banality of naivete. And part of that, too, is that the educational system, for a lot of people growing up in the U.S. and a lot of countries, I have groups from England, and we talk about the Boxer War, the Opium War, like, we never learned any of this stuff in school, or maybe we mentioned it. And I'm like, really? Because, I'm not British, and there are many reasons for that, starting with a war in the 18th century, but I got to think that imperialism is a pretty big reason why Britain had a decent standard of living into the 20th century. And, same thing in the U.S., we need to be aware of this. Again, that said, I think it's very important to note that one of the biggest differences is these things can be debated, they can be talked about, and there are differences of degrees. This whole idea, like this whataboutism. Well, this is bad, that's bad, so they cancel each other out. First of all, two things can be bad at the same time, and one thing can be more wrong than the other. Wrong is not a binary state. It is wrong, for example, to call a tomato a vegetable. It is very wrong to call it, a cat. And there are human rights issues that need to be discussed we probably won't get into those because then they'll just hit us with a cattle prod, but you know what I mean.
Yes. So history is a powerful tool. The way that you may bend it, some authorities it's a very powerful tool to use.
Yeah, I mean, it's the old cliche, he who controls the past controls the present, controls the future, I think I probably just totally mangled that quote, which is getting totally kicked out of any of the history pubs. But yeah, obviously one of the things that any regime, government, political system, elite, whatever hat you have, one of the things they will always try to do is shape the narrative of the past. And part of that is sometimes to create a teleology that says that what was always meant to be, or they will shape the past to kind of create a narrative that justifies the present. And this is something that happens in almost every context, in every culture, in every country. But in some places, you just kind of, the process by which that happens is just a little bit more violent. And I don't mean by violent always necessarily think of violence against people, but I mean violence against truth. What I mean is like violence against the process by which we learn, violence against the way we research, violence against the way we teach, the way that we, restrict those activities. And I think, there are countries that do that more than others.
So your job is basically seek for the facts and truths and tell it to people, teach it to people.
I love your optimism in me, Ziv. But if I was looking for truth, I would be I'd be into theology.
Okay.
If I was looking for facts, I think or proofs is like things that could be proven QED, I'd be a mathematician. History is very much about just trying to find the perspectives, to bring out those perspectives, to bring out those stories, to bring out the data that we have, knowing that it is fundamentally flawed and imperfect, and trying to use the judgment as best as we can, while standing on the shoulders of the historians and people who have done research before, the men and women who have written stuff before, and try to put the data and the information, as imperfect as is, into that context and try to come up with a new way of understanding something that maybe someone has written about before, or maybe something no one has written about before, but something that will help us to understand the past better and, hopefully understand a little bit more about the present and the future, and try to, in some ways, I think the best kind of history too is one that challenges preconceived notions, and especially challenges narratives that have been kind of imposed by elites, by states, by parties, by society. We've looked at it this way for a long time. Why? Isn't there another way we can look at this? Let's take a look. Let's run the tape again.
So it's not that dry. Okay, it's finding perspectives. Okay, let's talk, just before we finish, let's talk more about China's history. So if I don't know anything about China's history, what's the most fascinating era or part of it? Where should I start?
Wow.
What would you recommend?
Well, I think, again, this is just purely subjective.
Sure, what you like, I guess.
If I was to pick a particular era of Chinese history, and not just for its relevance to today, for example, I think it's good that people would learn about the 19th and 20th century is relevant for today, but I might look at sort of the Tang Dynasty. So
Tang Dynasty.
So it's going back to like the 6th, 7th century.
6th, 7th century, okay.
In that era, or sorry, excuse me, I'm taking that back for a second. 7th or 8th century.
7th or 8th century.
I have a thing with numbers. I don't remember them well, which is actually
not good for historian.
Yeah, I remember dates sometimes, but then what happens is when I try to add them up, I one time told a class that the U.S. was 400 years old, not because I didn't know the date 1776, just I couldn't do the math in my head.
Okay.
And the students always laugh like, "Hey, you can't remember numbers." I'm like, "Yeah, I also calculate your grades."
Yeah. So how many dynasties there were?
How many?
Yeah.
It depends on how you count. It depends how you count on them, because first of all, the use of the term dynasty is a little bit misleading, because dynasty kind of implies like this is like one like a family takes the throne, but a dynasty implies a continuity that doesn't really necessarily exist in Chinese history. These are really kind of these are states that have risen and fallen, sometimes in succession, but sometimes overlapping in each other, and also some of these states that are kind of part of this dynastic chronology were also created by people who, while today the government in China will insist are Chinese, at the time people living in China probably didn't see them as being the same. And, people were coming from the outside. And so you have like the major dynasties going back to the first kind of imperial dynasty, which is the Qin dynasty, because before that you had a system that was slightly different. But then the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty, then you have the Sui and the Tang, then the Song dynasty, which was in the kind of the beginning around, you're talking like the 10th, 11th, 12th into the 13th century. Then you have the Mongolians invading in the 13th century. They controlled China about 100 years. And then you have the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty are the final two. These are the major ones. But in between these major dynasties, you also have periods of disunity as well, when you have rival kingdoms and rival states. Some get afforded the title of dynasty in the chronology, some are just kingdoms, and a lot of them are happening at the same time.
Okay, so it's much more complicated. How many dynasties?
And,
All right.
and I think part of this thing too is today in China there's a real desire to create this kind of this idea that China is a fixed concept that extends back into some kind of distant historical past, and it's been the same, continuous, unified, leading inexorably to this moment. And that's the story you see when you go into the museums. But when you really look at Chinese history, you realize that it's the disunity and the complexity and the messiness and the lack of continuity that is actually the most fascinating part of the story.
For someone from outside.
Well, I think that's true. But of course, someone who's not in charge of trying to keep a very diverse country together, that this, doesn't always fit together as neatly as it may look like on the map. But at the same time, I think that, and then maybe this is just me. History is most interesting when it's messy.
Okay, interesting. Yes, everybody like to when you watch a game, you're waiting for the fight, no?
Well, I mean, the occasional times that I watch European football, waiting for someone to do something, those games, you want to see action.
Right.
A defensive battle is fascinating for those people who really understand the game, but really the average fan just wants to see somebody head the ball and
Yeah. So you say Tang Dynasty.
Yeah. But the reason I said the Tang Dynasty is that it was the period of time really in Chinese history when China was at its most open. If you go to the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an, which is today the city of the latter day city of Xi'an, kind of built sort of on that area. Chang'an at that time, if you were to Chang'an in the 7th or 8th century, this was the global capital. This was, New York, London, Tokyo rolled into one. This was the place you could go walk through the markets and the bazaars of the city, and you would see products, even merchants from as far as Western Asia, all over East Asia. You could even see it by the kind of religious institutions that were in the capital. You had Buddhist temples, Taoist academies, Taoist temples, Confucian academies, Confucian shrines, but you also had mosques. You also had synagogues. You also had Nestorian Christian churches. Part of this was just reflective of how cosmopolitan Chang'an society was. And it's not an accident. This was also when China historically was at its strongest. There's this idea China's at its strongest when it's open. Or maybe another way to say it, when the Chinese emperors were feeling strong, when they were feeling confident, culturally and politically, they allowed them to be open. And at times when the leadership has felt weaker or felt less confident, that's when they start closing in and they start making it more restrictive. And so one of the things about the Tang Dynasty, it was so much cultural confidence, and that allowed this kind of cosmopolitan culture where people came together. You had, for example, monks from China who were looking at translations of Buddhist sutras going, yeah, that looks wrong. We need to correct that. How would we do that? I got it. Let's just go to India. And they would come back, a decade later with all of the original documents. I mean, that was just kind of that era. So to me, that, especially as someone who is, forever a foreigner.
And picking up a history book is not something people do these days. They watch TV, right? Sometimes you have here and there, right? Something on Netflix recently. There was the Marco Polo, right?
Yes.
It's about the Yuan dynasty,
right?
Era. But I guess a lot of what you're talking about and what you teach, it doesn't exist, right? On TV.
Outside of China.
So in China, yes.
Yeah, in China, this is the thing that all these events are the products of great TV shows.
Right. So they're based on these events.
Right. But it's been harder to translate this outside of China, and you'd have to talk to someone who's in the media as to exactly why that's been the case. But it has been a challenge getting Chinese stories in front of an international audience in a way that the international audience can appreciate, but in a way that the Chinese back home feel is an authentic portrayal.
Right.
Because usually whenever something is popular overseas, they're always like, yes, but that's what the foreigners like.
Right.
And then immediately then, dismisses it as being somehow inauthentic.
Right.
Whether that's true or not, that's not for me to say, but that has been a challenge. And then the stuff that's been sort of, people think is really authentically Chinese, that has not always, traveled as well.
Right.
And, again, that's a entertainment question more than a history question.
So, okay, what would you recommend? How to start to learn a bit of history in a consumable way? For someone that's not a historian.
Sure.
A certain book you can recommend, or what?
Well, there's one book I recommend and one podcast I recommend.
Okay.
Actually, I should probably recommend two, but okay. One book I would recommend is a book I always suggest to people who are coming to China for the first time, but it's worthwhile reading even if you live here. It's got the rather prosaic title of China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know.
Okay.
And it's co-written by two academics I respect quite a bit, Jeffrey Wasserstrom and Maura Cunningham, both of whom are solid researchers, but they also are two academics who have done a lot of work writing for popular audiences in like magazines, journalism. And so they really, I feel both of them do a really good job in this book of it's kind of like an FAQ, like a question book. It's like, it's everything from, all right, so what is Confucianism? To,
so it's easy to consume.
To like, what was Mao's deal? And it's about 160 pages, and it's not in depth, but if you're just coming here like, I just want to kind of know the basics.
So I'll put the link in the bottom here, and what else?
Two podcasts I might recommend, and the first one I would say is the China History Podcast, hosted by Laszlo Montgomery, in which he has gone through every topic in Chinese history in a nice 30 to 45 minute, well-curated podcast. He gives you a good overview of these, and if you want to do and he has at one point, he has over the course of a couple of years, gone from the beginning to the end. You want to listen to it one a day as you're jogging, and he's got a good way of kind of presenting the material as well. And I think that's a really great way if people want to dive a little bit deeper. And then, just self-promotion that David, another fellow teacher in Beijing, David Moser, who and I have our own podcast called Barbarians at the Gate.
Barbarians at the Gate.
Which we take a look at different aspects of Chinese history, particularly in Chinese history and culture. And we kind of do deeper dives, generally somewhat irreverent, but deeper dives into some of these issues as well.
All right. I'll also put the links to those. Well, how often do you do the podcast? Yeah.
We try to do it once every 2 or 3 weeks.
Once every 2 or 3 weeks?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, interesting stuff. Thank you, Jeremiah.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I love this kind of stories. I love history. It's just that maybe I love watching YouTube videos more. That's my problem, something like that. So it's like finding the time and sitting and reading a book. It's but also we should mention your I don't remember if we did mention on the podcast the Beijing by food that you need if you come to Beijing. You can contact you through the website, I guess?
Right, yeah, so BeijingByFoot.com. We offer historic walks and programs for groups, for travel groups, and for educational groups. And yeah, absolutely. But if you're coming to Beijing, look me up. I'm happy to help out your group.
Yeah, he will take you out and try to come on a warmer day than today.
Yeah.
All right, and this was our podcast. Thank you again. And if you like what you see, give us the thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you next time.